So the next procedural process we're going to talk about is panel loops inside of ZBrush. So here I just have the scan data of Paul loaded in. You can also see I have the on-screen reference loaded through Spotlight. And then I've gone through and already pre-processed Paul's head and generated a base mesh out of the original scan data. So if I come over to my subtool palette here and go to the second subtool in the list, you can see I have the scan data has been mirror and welded. I've then dynameshed it so it has even topology across the entire surface, and I've went through and scrubbed and sculpted around the area where Paul's face used to be to create an inner shell for the helmet. So if I come to the side and turn on transparency and turn off ghost and then turn on Paul's scan data, you can see that I have a shape now that fully engulfs Paul's head. So this is going to allow Paul to actually fit inside the helmet when it actually gets turned into a tangible element. So now that I have this kind of structure set up, we're going to use panel loops to start generating some of these forms on the actual helmet. Panel loops is located under the geometry tab, so if I come over here and scroll down to the geometry subpalette under tool, then you can go to this edge loop panel here, and underneath here you have a button for panel loops. The functionality of panel loops is based around polygrouping that you may have on your model. So right now my entire model is one polygroup, so I'm going to hold Control Shift quick and it's going to give me the select rectangle brush. I'm then just going to isolate a portion of this mesh, and with that section isolated I'm going to come down to the polygroups tab and just do a group visible. And this is going to assign a new polygroup to that area of the model. And I'm just going to click this a few more times just to get a more vibrant color on this guy so you can see the difference. I'm going to hold Control Shift again and just click on my canvas, which is going to bring everything back visible on the model. And then if I come up, you'll see I'm going to go back to this panel loops button here and I'm just going to press it. Now you'll notice that wherever those polygroups were different, so the difference between this color here and the red, I'm getting a thickness applied. So it's actually giving me a panel based on every single polygroup on the model. So this is going to allow us to come through and set up polygroups quickly on our model in these different chunks and then generate panels for them. Now the other options you have on the panel loops here, so if I just undo this quick, you control the thickness of your panels. So if I come over here and just type in something like 0.5 and then click panel loops, you'll notice that my panels are now thicker than they were originally. Another thing here, you have the elevation, and this controls how these panel loops actually are applied. So if I go to an elevation of 0, it's going to apply the thickness outward and inward. If I go to an elevation of negative 100, it's going to apply that thickness inward, and then of course positive 100, it's going to apply it outward. So since we already have this kind of interior shape set up for that helmet, we want this elevation to be at 100. So all the panel loops are going to grow outward and not penetrate back into that area where Paul's head actually needs to fit inside. Another thing here, you have a slider for bevel and polish, and this is just going to control how these edges of these panels actually look after they're created. Another thing over here is this bevel profile curve. So if I open that up, you'll see it's actually just a little graph, and in here this curve is actually going to determine how the edges of those bevels look. So you can see, just think of the tapering along the side, and that's going to determine the actual angles in which are going to appear on those panel loops as they're created. Another thing with this is that the graph is actually, if you think of it as a value as 0 to 100. The 50% line is going to determine how much each panel embeds into the next panel beside it. So right now I'm a little bit below that 50% line. So if I come up here and look, you can see I have a nice gap in between all those panels. If I don't want that gap, I'm just going to undo that quick, just move this past that 50% line. So now I'm around 60%, and then run that panel again. And you're going to notice that I now have both those panel loops are bumping right into each other. Along with the graph too, you can change the shape on the fly just by adding curves. So if you want it to be more spiky in the middle and then have some sort of random cuts like this, you can just do that, and now you're going to end up with a different type of bevel along the edges of those panels. To remove any of these kind of lines in here that say you start clicking all over the place and you generate a whole bunch of points, to get rid of them, just click on them and then just drag off, and then that will remove them from that curve window. So if you mess up or do anything crazy, you can just come back in and start removing those points, and then just come back in and redraw those lines like so. So I'm just going to put this back to that roughly the area we had, which is a little bit below that 50% there, and then just run panel loops and make sure that is correct. So now I'm going to come through and actually start setting up polygroups for this entire model to kind of mimic some of these shapes we have on the helmet. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I start with, an entirely solid polygroup across the entire model. So I want to remove this, quick one we did just to demonstrate the process. So I'm going to go back down to polygroups here, and I'm just going to hit auto groups. Now another thing you can do inside of ZBrush that's kind of a hotkey for this auto group or group visible functionality is whatever you have visible on your canvas. So if I just come to my model here, Control Shift drag this rectangle out, hold Alt and just hide it. And now I'm just going to have part of this model here. So if I just have this visible here and I hit Control W on my keyboard, it's going to give only the visible area a new polygroup. So it's kind of the similar kind of functionality as coming over here and hitting Group Visible. Now when I hit Control Shift and bring it back, you're going to notice I have two polygroups in those areas. So you can quickly go through your model and just hide sections and then hit Control W and hide some more, hit Control W, hide some more, hit Control W, hide some more, hit Control W, and you can quickly populate polygroups all over your model. And then once you have these polygroups kind of set, you just come up and run panel loops, and you're going to get a panel loop for every single one of those polygroups. So the select rectangle is nice for generating the polygroups like that, but it's a little bit harsh, and so we have a lot of smooth shapes through here. So I'm going to go in first and get the select lasso brush, which is going to allow me to kind of get some more curved forms on my polygroups. So I'm going to hit B on my keyboard to open up the brush menu, and then I'm going to isolate by the letter S and find the select lasso brush, like so. You get a little dialog just telling you it's the active selection. Just hit OK. And now if you hit Control Shift on your keyboard, you now should get the select lasso. And so now you can go through and kind of isolate these groups on your model, hit Control W to give it a new polygroup, and start generating these forms. So the model I know right now, kind of stops at the neck over here for the actual helmet, so I'm just going to make this bottom part a new polygroup really quick. So I'm going to turn off perspective, hold Control Shift and drag a lasso out like this, then hold Alt to turn it red and release. And with that part hidden, I'm just going to hit Control W, which will give me that. This model also has, a glass panel on the front, which is one of the key kind of forms on it. So I'm just going to hold Control Shift and drag another lasso like so, hold Alt to make it hidden, and then hit Control W to give the rest of the stuff a new panel group. And now I'm going to go through and just keep doing this on my model. So I have this kind of middle section, so I'm just going to isolate out a part of that as well. Hold Alt to make it red. After it's hidden, Control W. I have that ear portion, so draw that out, hold Alt, Control W. Now at this stage too, I'm just kind of trying to get the major forms out of the model, so I'm not trying to do an exact match. And a lot of times when I do the conceptual stage, like where these reference images were generated from, this panel loop option gives you a lot of freedom and functionality. So you can kind of go through and set up groups all over the place, and then just kind of pull forms out from these initial groups. So don't worry too much at this stage of trying to match things, because you're going to be able to deform stuff once you get it turned all into these panel groups. So I'm just going through and hitting key elements on my model like so. Now another thing, if you're actually doing these little lasso selects and you accidentally do a green one and it makes just that part of your model visible, you can just undo to get the whole thing back, or if you're at the very end like I am here and you just want to get everything back from your model, you can just hold Control and Shift and then just drag off, and that will flip that visibility as well. So if you ever find yourself accidentally doing the green lasso instead of the red lasso, there's a few ways you can get your model back like that. So after you have these all kind of plotted out, your major forms on your panel loops, just hold Control and Shift and click off, and that's going to bring back your entire model. So now if I came up here, I'm going to turn perspective back on, and I just click this panel loop button, it's going to generate new panel loops for all those groups. Well, there's a few areas on this model I don't really want panel group loops generated. So I don't really want this neck area generated, and I can just generate the visor later on, so I'll probably just remove this one as well. So the panel loops functionality has an option to only generate panel loops on the areas of your model that are visible as well. So if I come through and just hold Control Shift and then click the body, and then Control-Shift click again, which will make it hidden. I can then Control-Shift click that visor, and now I'm just left with those core elements of the actual helmet. So with that part of the mesh being the only thing that's visible, if I now come over here and run a panel loops, you're going to see it's only going to generate panel loops in those areas. So this allows you to kind of go through a whole model, and if you only want certain sections, just hide those groups, and then when you actually press the panel loops button over there, it's only going to give you panel loops on the areas that are visible on your model. So now that I have the kind of core areas of the helmet kind of broken out, I can now clear my mask and then hold Control and Shift and Control and Shift again and isolate that center section, and Control and Shift to hide that neck portion. So now with those hidden, I now need to come over here to the Geometry tab again and go down to Modify Topology and then do a Delete Hidden. And now I'm just left with the actual areas of the mesh that I wanted to have panel loops on. So I can go back up to my subtool palette and turn on the scan data of Paul, and you can see that those panel loops are now extruding out because we set that elevation slider to positive 100, so it's not embedding into that area where Paul's head needs to fit into, and now I have a nice kind of shell flushed out around the scan data. So now one really nice thing about panel loops, when you generate them, it gives you these really nice polygroups throughout the entire model. And this is where some of the fun comes in with the actual sculpting and designing with these panel loops. So I'm just going to select my move brush. I'm going to hit B on my keyboard, isolate by the letter M, and just find the move brush there. I'm going to get a pretty large scale brush and make sure I have symmetry turned on. So by default, I could just start moving and pushing and pulling these shapes here, but it's doing kind of a global function across the helmet. Well, if I come over to the brush tab here and go to auto masking and turn on this mask by polygroups, now wherever I start moving, whatever polygroup my cursor is in when I actually start doing a sculpting process, it's only going to allow me to sculpt in that area. So you can see here I have just the move brush selected, and I have that mask by polygroups turned on. So if I come here and just start pulling this out, you can see it's only going to affect that blue area of that polygroup. So wherever I move my cursor around it, it's not going to grab anything else. So with this, I can now come through and start doing really kind of large changes on my model and generate some interesting forms out of it. So if you want to do some sort of helmet designs like this, you're getting really nice kind of clean lines and getting these really cool kind of helmet designs out of it. So you can go through your model and just kind of explore with these kind of different features here until you get like different shapes you like, and you can go pretty crazy with these. And since it's all just panel groups, it's going to give you really nice topology along the way. So this is a neat way to kind of explore different helmet designs without too much effort. And this is where a lot of my structures for the actual forms here will start with this actual panel loop process. You just can kind of go through and design away and find lines and forms that you actually like on your model. So it's a pretty cool process, and it works extremely fast. So you can see I grabbed one of those other panel lines there, and you can grab like these little ones on the side here, and it's going to give you different effects depending on where those polygroups and from the panel lines are at. So that's the basis for the panel loops, and we're actually going to continue sculpting on a version of the model that was created with panel loops as we build a helmet inside of ZBrush.